Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and we are back with the first of many GPU launches for 2025. Things are kicking off with Intel's Arc B570, which is of course the smaller sibling to the B580 that we reviewed back in December. Alongside its reduced specifications, the B570 also sports a reduced price, targeting a $219 MSRP, making this one of the cheapest GPUs that we have reviewed in years. But exactly what can it bring to the table at that price point, and just how much slower is it than the $249 B580? All that and more is covered in today's review. Announced alongside the B580, the B570 that we are reviewing today is more or less the same thing, but it's just been cut back slightly in a few key areas, and that has allowed Intel to drop the price by 12%, targeting the $219 MSRP, whereas the B580 fetches a $30 premium. That being said, pricing and availability remains a pretty big problem for the B580, as I've not been able to find it for less than £290 here in the UK, despite the fact it launched at £249. As such, that means prices for the B570 have also crept up, and right now I've not been able to find it listed for pre-order for any less than £250. To quickly recap the spec though, the B570 is very similar to the B580 in that it's built on the same BMG G21 silicon, but just stripped back in a few key areas. It has 2 fewer XE cores for instance, with a total of 18, while it has 144 XMX engines and TMUs, down from 160 on the B580. Graphics clock speed is also reduced at 2500 MHz, while there's a cutback memory system too, with 10 gigs of GDDR6 memory operating at 19 gigabits per second over a 160-bit interface, and that gives total memory bandwidth at 380 gigabytes a second. Given those cutbacks, it does make sense that power draw is also lower, rated at 150 watts TBP compared to 190 watts for the B580. For my testing today then, I am using our brand new GPU test system that is powered by MSI, and if you want to learn more about this, I did actually make a full video on it earlier this week, so I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. It is however packing in the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, the MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, and there's 64 gigs of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 6000 megatransfers CL30 memory. By now you've probably also realised that we don't have one of Intel's limited edition models for review today, as they're not actually making them for the B570. Instead, we were sent the ASRock Challenger aftermarket card, which I'll be using for all testing today. It's also worth saying that I am focusing on 1080p for the data in this video. I will touch on 1440p for the games where it was possible, but I think 1080p is the realistic use case for a GPU of this caliber. However, if you do want to see 1080p, 1440p, and even 4K, every single one of our benchmark charts is over on the full review on kitguru.net, and again I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. Kicking off then with Alan Wake 2, at 1080p the B570 delivers 37 FPS using the high preset, and that makes it 11% slower than both the B580 and the RTX 4060. It's also dead level with the Arc Alchemist A770, and just a frame faster than the RTX 3060 12GB. 1440p gaming though isn't really possible at these settings, as we only saw 25 FPS on average and even worse 1% lows, so you definitely want to enable upscaling or drop down to something like the low preset for Alan Wake 2. Moving on to Black Myth Wukong though, this one appears to be something of a problem for the battlemage family, given the B570 is actually second bottom in our chart. It only managed 22 FPS on average, and granted it is a highly demanding game, but that still makes it slower than even the Arc A750, so I'm really not sure what's going on here. Cyberpunk 2077 however is a much better experience on the B570. We averaged 74 FPS at 1080p using ultra settings with no upscaling, and that makes it 12% slower than the B580. It's also 7% faster than AMD's RX 7600, and it's about level with the RTX 4060, so that is pretty good going for this caliber of GPU. 1440p is also very playable in Cyberpunk with an average just below 50 FPS, and now the B570 is 11% faster than the RX 7600, while it's actually level with the 7600 XT and Intel A770. Moving on to Final Fantasy XVI, this is a new addition to our test suite, and it is incredibly GPU heavy, with the B570 managing just 29 FPS on average at 1080p. That puts it squarely between the A750 and the A770, while it's 9% slower than the B580. Forza Horizon 5 is next, and this remains an incredibly well optimized title, so it's really no surprise to see the B570 hitting 83 FPS at 1080p extreme settings, putting it level with the A770 and the RX 7600. It's 14% slower than the B580 here, and only 8% behind the RTX 4060. 1440p gaming is also no problem in this title. This time it's still averaging 70 frames per second, so that's highly impressive performance, and that sandwiches the B570 between the A770 and the RX 7600. Ghost of Tsushima is another title that runs very well on battlemage. At least it does now, after the initial stuttering issues were fixed last month. At 1080p though, the B570 hits 64 FPS on average, putting it just behind the RTX 4060 Ti no less, a hugely impressive result considering the price difference. Even at 1440p, it's still managing 49 FPS using the very high preset, once again putting it level with the 4060 Ti, while it's 16% slower than the ARC B580. As for Horizon Forbidden West, with an average of 57 FPS, the B570 is once again 10% slower than the B580, though that's still very impressive considering it is basically matching the performance of the 7600 XT and the RTX 4060, both of which are a good chunk more expensive. Even gaming at 1440p is solid enough for Horizon Forbidden West, with the B570 hitting 45 FPS. But get this, the B570 is now a whopping 24% faster than the RTX 4060, which I believe is due to insufficient VRAM on the GeForce GPU. So that 10GB frame buffer for the B570 is clearly well worth having. As for The Last of Us Part 1, here the B570 is capable of hitting 50 FPS on average at 1080p, once again sandwiching it between the 7600 and the RTX 4060, while it's 16% slower than the B580, but 11% faster than the A770. The B570 is also very closely matched to the A770 in A Plague Tale Requiem, but it has substantially better 1% lows, which is really good to see. It's also 6% behind the RX 7600 when looking at the 1080p data. When looking at the 1440p data, I'd say it's just about manageable, but we're only looking at circa 30 FPS performance, so you definitely want to enable upscaling or do a few image quality tweaks. Moving on though, I do think the evidence suggests that battlemage does struggle with Unreal Engine 5 games, as again we can see the B570 fall off in Senua, Saga, Hellblade 2. At 1080p, it is right down the bottom of the chart, slower than even the RTX 3060, and it's actually a hair behind the A770 as well. Moving on though to Starfield, and in terms of the average frame rate, the B570 does relatively well here, coming in ahead of both the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 by single-digit margins. The 1% lows are more of a struggle, however, coming in worse than either of those two GPUs, which isn't an issue we can see with Intel's Alchemist GPUs, so I do think some work could be done there to improve things in that regard. There's no such issue in Total War Warhammer 3, however. At 1080p, the B570 is absolutely flying, with 84 FPS on average, once again putting it 14% behind the B580, but it's within touching distance of the 7600 and RTX 4060. At 1440p as well, we still get a very solid 56 frames per second on average, putting the B570 within just 1% of the RX 7600. That is it for our per game benchmarks then, and now we're going to move on to look at the big picture with our 12 game average. Over the 12 games we tested then, the ARC B570 managed an average frame rate of 51 FPS at 1080p. That makes it 13% slower than the B580, it's 5% behind the RTX 4060, but dead level with AMD's RX 7600. It's also just a hair ahead of the last generation A770, while it comes in 12% faster on average than the RTX 3060 12GB. As for 1440p, obviously the frame rate is much lower here, and there are plenty of games where you need to either drop down to lower image quality settings or enable upscaling for a playable experience. But on average here, it's 15% behind the B580, it's 5% faster than the RX 7600, and barely 2% slower than the RTX 4060. As for what that data means in terms of the cost per frame analysis then, I'm going to first start by looking at the MSRP in US dollars, given there's actually no official UK MSRP in British pounds. What we can see when looking at this data though is a value proposition that is very similar to the B580. The B570 turns out to be 12% cheaper and 13% slower. That sounds reasonable enough, and it is still right at the top of the chart, but I personally do think Intel needs to be a bit more aggressive with the B570's pricing. We'd actually expect better value at the lower price tier, and we have to remember the B570 has 2 gigs less VRAM as well. And as it happens, things actually look worse when we look at the current retail pricing, this time in GBP. Right now, the B570 cannot be found for pre-order for less than £250, which is simply too much. It actually makes the value proposition worse than the RX 7600 and RTX 4060, which I really don't think is a position that Intel can compete from. Moving on though to look at ray tracing performance, I'm going to start off with Alan Wake 2. Here we are actually using quality upscaling, but even then you're not going to be enabling the high preset for ray tracing in this game. It is simply way too much for this class of GPU to handle, with the B570 barely hitting 20 FPS on average. Black Myth Wukong is even worse. This game is clearly designed to be played with an Nvidia GPU, and the B570 falls well down the chart, averaging just 13 FPS, again, even with quality upscaling enabled. Thankfully, Cyberpunk 2077 is much more performant for the B570, though do know I'm not using path tracing here, but rather using the Ultra preset at 1080p with no upscaling enabled. With that in mind, we're looking at 32 FPS on average, which is okay. It would be better if you did enable upscaling, but without it, the B570 absolutely crushes even AMD's RX 7600 XT. I did, however, still encounter frequent hard locks as we found during our B580 testing, so this is still an issue for Intel to fix, and it renders the game, I'd say, pretty much unplayable with these RT settings enabled, as we just ran into hard lock after hard lock after hard lock. Next up though is F124, and we do get playable frame rates at 1080p, though we're not exactly flying at 36 FPS on average. Still, that is much better than what the AMD RX 7600 is able to manage, but Intel can't match the RTX 3060 here. It is, however, very good to see that the frame times have been significantly improved since the launch of the B580. Here we're looking at a frame time plot comparing the B580 using its launch driver from December to the B570 using its own launch driver from this month, and aside from a couple of small frame time spikes, it is a very consistent experience for the B570, so credit must go to Intel for fixing that issue. I did, however, go back and try to retest the B580 with this new driver to see if the fix would also work on that GPU, but no matter what I tried, the game didn't seem to want to render in. All I could see was the HUD, so clearly there is more work still to be done. Likewise, Ratchet & Clank remains completely broken on battlemage GPUs. The B570 proved even worse than the B580, and it was a stuttery mess the whole time, barely getting above 10 FPS. Interestingly though, when looking at the GPU power draw in this game, I noticed it was very low for the B570, barely hitting 60 or 70 watts, perhaps suggesting there's some sort of bandwidth issue at play as the GPU is being starved, but it's hard to say for sure. Thankfully, Returnal plays much better, and it's a genuinely good experience with maxed out ray tracing at 1080p. Admittedly, it does only have 2 ray traced effects, being shadows and reflections, but nearly 60 FPS on average is still a very solid result for the B570, given it's actually about level with Nvidia's RTX 4060. Shadow of the Tomb Raider plays as well as you'd expect, given it's over 6 years old at this point and only features ray traced shadows. Even then, the fact that the B570 is level with the more expensive RX 7600 XT really shows you the potential for the battlemage architecture when it comes to ray tracing. Lastly, I'm going to close out with Star Wars Outlaws, a game where I unfortunately still experience regular crashing with battlemage GPUs. When I was able to play the game, performance is actually decent, about level with the RX 7600, but it's still sub 30 FPS, so you would want to enable upscaling. That is, if you can actually run the game longer than 5 minutes. Overall, ray tracing performance then is not as impressive as what we saw from the B580. Granted, the abysmal performance in Ratchet & Clank does pull the average down, but we're still looking at the B570 coming in 21% slower on average than its bigger sibling. Now, that still means the B570 is actually on par with the RX 7600 XT, a GPU that is again a good chunk more expensive, and it's really not far off the performance of the RTX 3060 12GB. Time to hit pause on those game benchmarks, however, and take a little bit of time just to look closely at the ASRock Challenger card, its design, and then we're going to look at thermals, acoustics, and power draw. The card itself is a relatively conventional design. It has a black plastic shroud that's accented with some reflective areas alongside the Challenger branding. It's obviously a dual fan unit, and each fan measures approximately 100mm in diameter. As for dimensions, the Challenger is a little bit bigger than the B580 limited edition, but it's still a compact dual slot card, coming in at 249 by 132 by 41mm. The front side of the card is home to the ASRock and Intel Arc logos, plus there's a small bluish-greenish LED strip which you can actually toggle on or off via the switch at the end of the PCB. ASRock has also fitted a metal backplate to the card, which I love to see, and this features a large flow-through cutout to allow air to pass directly through the heatsink. Power is supplied by a single 8-pin connector, and we find 3 DisplayPort 2.1 and 1 HDMI 2.1 video connectors. Do note, however, that only the middle DisplayPort is rated for UHBR 13.5 bandwidth, while the others are rated at UHBR 10.
If you're looking for a new chair, then definitely go and check out boolies.co.uk. They offer a whole host of gaming and office chairs that come in a variety of different finishes and different colours.
As for our thermal results then, I've obviously only tested the one B570 card for launch, so I've also included the B580 limited edition here just as a reference point. It's not a direct comparison as the B570 draws less power, but it just gives you an idea. In any case, the B570 Challenger is a very competent design, with the GPU core hitting just 60 degrees, while the GPU global and VRAM metrics topped out at 66 degrees, so absolutely nothing to worry about. In fact, what makes that thermal performance even more impressive is that the Challenger ran so quietly under load. In my testing, the fans did not spin up past 1080 RPM, so the noise didn't even register on my sound meter. It is that quiet and clearly indicates that the cooler design is way overkill for this level of power. Not that I'm complaining. Speaking of power draw, for this we actually use Nvidia's PCAT tool to measure power draw of the graphics card only on a per game per resolution basis. That means for every single game we test at every single resolution, we also plot power draw. So I won't go over every single one of those charts in this video, otherwise we'd be here for hours and hours. But if you do want to see all of that power testing, you can find it in the written review on kitguru.net. Instead, in this video, I'm going to be focusing on the average of all 12 games tested at 1080p. Just as a reminder, Intel states a total board power of 150 watts for the B570, but just as we found with the B580, in practice the actual power draw is much lower. Averaged over the 12 games I tested, the Challenger drew 132.3 watts, making it a very low power GPU indeed. Now, you can already tell that the Nvidia GPUs are more efficient, considering the RTX 4060 Ti draws a similar amount of power, yet is a good chunk faster, but it's hardly a horrible amount of power draw for the B570. Now we're going to look at performance per watt, a simple calculation where we divide frame rate by the power draw for each game, and then present the average result here. As it turns out, the B570 is just as efficient as the B580, putting it on a similar level to something like AMD's RX 7700 XT. That means it is a really solid improvement over the Alchemist series, delivering exactly 50% more performance per watt compared to the A750. It does, however, still lag behind Nvidia and the RTX 40 series here, and it'll be really interesting to see if Nvidia can make further gains with the upcoming 50 series cards. Just like the B580 as well, idle power draw is still on the high side, hovering around 32 watts in my testing, but you can enable the same sort of fix to reduce it. First, you need to make sure that ASPM is enabled in the BIOS, and then go into the control panel and tweak the power settings, specifically the PCI Express link state power management option, choosing maximum power savings. For me, this did show an immediate drop in idle power, but it was still higher than expected at around 22 watts, even after letting it sit for a bit, so it does help, but it won't get you down to the likes of the RTX 4060, which idles at around 8 to 10 watts. So that brings us to the end of this review, and I think it's fair to say that most of the focus around the battlemage series has gone onto the B580, with the B570 kind of flying under the radar somewhat, but As it turns out, it is a capable graphics card for 1080p gaming. That said, I do actually think there would be more excitement for the B570 if it actually launched before the B580. That's because, fundamentally, this is a $220 graphics card that is trading blows with the likes of the RX 7600 and RTX 4060 while also offering more VRAM. Considering that both of those competitors are a good chunk more expensive than the B570, at least in terms of the launch MSRP, and Intel is definitely coming out favourably in those comparisons, which is really good news. It's when we look at the B570 in relation to the B580, however, that things start to get murky. As it turns out, in my testing, the B570 is 13% slower on average at 1080p, despite being just 12% cheaper and shipping with 2 gigs less VRAM. For me, that's just not enough of a price difference for the B570 to be able to etch out its own niche in the market. It's not like the B570 is bad value, as it's still right at the top of our cost per frame chart, but I think with another $20 lopped off the price, it would make more sense relative to its faster and more expensive sibling. Complicating things further is the fact that, right now, the B570 cannot be pre-ordered for less than £250 here in the UK, and that only worsens the value proposition for this card. AMD's RX 7600, for instance, can be found for just 230 quid at the time of filming, or RTX 4060 starts from about £255. Yes, both of those are only 8GB cards, but I firmly believe Intel must offer a decent discount relative to its competition for its GPUs to have appeal, simply because it's much more of a risk buying a battlemage GPU than it is something from AMD or Nvidia, and right now, based on these UK prices, that is simply not happening. There are, of course, still driver complaints to be had around this series of GPUs, as I showed earlier in the video. However, in fairness to Intel, things have actually improved a fair bit from the launch of the B580 already. So of the 18 games I tested, I only had 3 giving me issues, and incidentally, they were all ones with ray tracing enabled. So of the 12 games where I only looked at rasterized performance, I did not encounter any driver bugs. So that is definitely good news for Intel and its battlemage series of GPUs. New issues have come to light since then, however, with testing from both Hardware Canucks and Hardware Unboxed revealing battlemage performance can drop off significantly when paired with an older CPU. We've just upgraded to a new 9800X 3D test system, so I've been really busy re-benchmarking all of our GPUs, so I've not been able to test that for myself yet, but I did put the question to Intel and they gave me the following statement. We, Intel, are aware of reports of performance sensitivity in some games when paired with older generation processors, and we are investigating. Considering just how far Intel's Alchemist series of GPUs have come since their launch in October 2022, I do remain 100% confident that Intel will continue to improve the battlemage series. Right now, however, I'm just still not ready to be able to fully recommend these GPUs given the issues just laid out. The B570 as well, I think, really could benefit from a price adjustment just to help it step out from the B580 shadow, as at its core it is a very capable entry-level GPU, and I'm optimistic it is one that's going to get better with time. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation, you can find an invite link to our Discord server down in the description. And while you're there, you can help us out by picking up a t-shirt from our merch store, such as the ones you can see on screen right now. Lastly, if you're feeling particularly generous, you can even consider backing us on Patreon. But that's it for me, guys. I'm Dominic the Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.